We're moving on to our next big topic here in section 5, and that topic has to do with routing audio for your mixing inside of a digital audio workstation as compared to if you were trying to, route the audio on, say, an analog mixing console. With the mixing console, it's a physical piece of hardware, so there are going to be limitations. In the computer, the limitation is just how strong and powerful the computer is. So if your computer is able to handle 300 tracks, you can handle 300 tracks. It would never be practical or even possible to really make a mixing console that could handle that much. And the same thing is true for the actual routing of the audio. And if you just look at this image here of a patch bay, you can see how quickly things can get hectic in the real world and how you might have to spend a lot more time plugging in and plugging out cables as compared to really focusing in on the details and getting creative with your tracks that you're going to be mixing. That's really the benefit of the computer, is that you can spend more time being creative, more time focusing on details, and less time kind of fiddling around with cables. So that's why we're spending a lot of time talking about routing possibilities. And as long as you understand what is possible, then the sky is really the limit in what it is you want to do with your mix. And this brings me to one other big point, which is the difference between making music and mixing music. When you're making music, you don't want to be too concerned with details, because if you get really wrapped up in that, it can often break the flow of the production, and then, the actual music may suffer. Where in the mixing stage, we are going to dig really deep into the flexibility and all of the routing possibilities and ways you can process your audio, because this is the time to do it. This is where you're focusing on those small enhancements to try and bring the track together, make it cohesive. And there are times where routing audio in what seem like complex ways is going to help you get there. So we don't have to worry about the physical limitations of the hardware of the mixing console. We don't have to worry about having tons of cables flying all over the place. We can make our routings quick, simple, and make it all look nice and organized. And hopefully that will lead to a better mix at the end of the day. For me, the greatest advantage of the digital audio workstation over a hardware mixing console is flexibility and also ease of use. So if you are going to be working in the computer, you might as well take advantage of its strengths, and specifically its strengths with routing audio. As we've already talked about, you have unlimited channels inside of the computer, so there's no reason to ever have to worry about running out of input or output jacks. You're going to have as many channels as you want, and all of that audio can go wherever you want it to go. So it's just a matter of learning and understanding when it's appropriate to route audio in certain ways and when you might just want to leave it alone. Right on the back of that, routing is a whole lot easier inside of the computer, which is what we will come to find out in the next few videos. And finally, you're not just stuck with what you get. And this is a really important concept that I think maybe older mixing engineers don't always fully grasp or take advantage of. We make music, so we're here as mixing engineers who are used to making music as well. So the way we hear a track is going to be a little bit different. We're not just listening to that track thinking, okay, let's make the best of what we have. We're listening to it and thinking, let's make this as good as it can possibly be. So for example, if you want to add a track and add a channel and put in a new part, you can totally do that. And it's very simple and easy to do inside of the computer. If you want to take a track, for example, let's say it's a single violin and it's kind of brittle and it's not really doing anything, and you want to enhance it to make it seem like a lush string part, you can duplicate that same part out like 5 or 6 times. You can slightly, detune them all, maybe throw a chorus on a couple, EQ them all differently, put them all into a reverb, and suddenly you started with this one kind of weak string, and now it sounds like it's, maybe 4 or 5 string players all adding to that part, which is going to enhance the track. Now, that being said, there is the philosophy that I do adhere to of more channels, more problems. So only do things when you really have a reason to do them. But my point is, in the computer, you really don't have to compromise. If you hear a part and you really want to transform it into something else, it's very simple and easy to do that. On to the actual routing possibilities, and these are what we're going to be covering in more detail in the next few videos, beginning with parallel. Parallel, very straightforward. You take an audio track, you duplicate that track, you process one different from the other, and then you combine them to make a blend. By extension, we have this idea of grouping, where you could take, for example, something that's been in parallel and then group it together and process that mix that you've just created between the two. You could process those guys together, or more commonly, what you do is you're going to group similar parts. So you might put all the synths into one group, which you could then either process together, or at the very least, you're going to put things in groups for organization reasons. And we're going to look at all of the layers and levels involved in grouping in the next video. We also have the send return configuration. So a return track is just something that you set up separate, as I think you saw before in the DAW I was working with. They put it at the bottom near the master track, where you can take all of your regular audio and instrument tracks from above and send them into that return, which you can then have a specific processor on. So commonly this is used for something like reverb. If you're trying to put everything into the same space, instead of having to duplicate that reverb onto every track individually, you can put that reverb onto the return track and then just send parts of the signals from above into that to then get you that nice, cohesive reverb sound. But it doesn't just have to be reverb. You can really put anything on a return track if you want, and that's kind of some of the fun and flexibility and creativity that is going to define you as a mix engineer. But where things get really crazy is when you start to combine all three. So for example, we could take, let's say we have 3 snare drums, okay? Or we have 1 snare drum and we've decided to duplicate it to then process it in parallel. Okay, so we have that in parallel, we group it. All right, so now we have that snare, the 2 tracks in the snare that have been processed in a parallel configuration. They've now been grouped. Okay, so from there, we could put that group inside of the bigger drum group and then process all of the drums together and then send all of those drums into a reverb. So that may sound really confusing right now, and it probably does, but as you'll see in the actual examples, it's pretty straightforward, and there would be a logical reason for doing something like that. But I'm just going to emphasize one final time before we move on to start getting into the nitty-gritty here, that you always need to have a reason for doing it. If you can't think of a reason to route your audio in a more complex way, like all of these examples here, then don't do it and just stick to the basics. Only when you start to hear and have a reason for making these routings should you go ahead and do that. But in my case here, with a decent amount of experience and having made a track and knowing what direction I want to take it in, I know that these routings are going to be very useful for me, but they may not be as useful for you. So stick to your gut, only do what you think needs to be done, and that is always going to lead to the very best results, in my opinion, for where you're at in terms of experience and how you're listening. As you gain more experience, suddenly then it might make more sense to make those routings. But right now, if it's still a little confusing, a little cloudy, rewatch these videos again and again, and maybe then you'll start to have some ideas when you get to the mixing yourself. So in the next few videos, we're going to jump in and talk about all of these different routing possibilities in a little bit more detail.